Hello guys, welcome back to another video, and today it is time for another patch review. That's right, KARDS is getting another balance patch, and it's been the first time in a while. I think November was the last time we had a balance patch. And this balance patch, there's no official date for it yet, however, it's going to be between the 21st and the 28th of January. Probably the 25th or the 26th, if I had to guess. They have announced that in the esports channel just because for people playing in tournaments, there's the 21st is the OCC play-ins and the 28th is the OCC top 8. They have announced that it will be in between there, so people who are going to be playing in the top 8 have to plan around these balance changes. So what's in these balance changes? Well, let's get straight into the first card, and these are in order of class, or nation. These are not in order of nerfs and buffs. So we're going to see some nerfs, we're going to see some buffs. And we are starting off with Britain with a pretty substantial nerf, maybe the most impactful of the entire patch. Up first, with the nerf to 5th Parachute Brigade. It is losing an operation cost, however, it is gaining a cost to play. So the operation cost and the cost to play are now switched. And this means a lot for quite a few decks. One, for Mobilize, this is a huge hit to Mobilize, just because Mobilize is almost like a combo deck, right? You play down the Potez, and then you try to play down as many Mobilize units as you can. And having a Mobilize unit that costs 0 means that you can play down an extra unit a turn before. So you can even do Potez and then 3 Parachutes on turn 4 to trigger Potez 3 times. Or you can play Potez and the 73rd and 2 Parachutes. Something like that. Not being able to play out the parachutes for free is a huge deal, and the operation cost, well, it's good that they did buff it in some way to make up for the fact that it's costing 1. I don't think that's going to be a huge deal. It doesn't have Fury, so it's not attacking multiple times per turn. It's still an infantry. It's still really, really slow, and you can only play 1 on turn 1, which is by far the biggest impact of this, is it's stopping parachute high rolls, and this is most likely why they made this change. This was something we saw in CA quite a bit, which is Combined Arms, the German-Britain variety with Hummers. I'm sure you've seen it. And what this means is you can no longer play 4 parachutes on turn 1, or 3 parachutes and a Hummer on turn 1, or if you're in Mobilize, 2 or 3 parachutes and like a first airborne. It's preventing you from getting all of that on the board on turn 1, where really the only response is Winter Warfare. Or if you go second, then they can play a Tora, potentially. And Mobilize is a snowballing mechanic. You don't want your opponent to have 4 cards on the board, all of which need to be damaged, or they will start to grow, because otherwise you will very quickly have 4/4 units, or 4/5/5 units on the board that you played for free on turn 1. So, yeah, I'm happy that they made this change. I do genuinely feel bad for all of the people out there who love playing Mobilize or love playing CA, because I do know what it is like to have your favorite deck nerfed. I've experienced this many, many times. But I think for the overall health of the game moving forward, I think it's a positive thing that this change has been made. But then we got to the next change, which is going to be actually a buff to Britain. Not a particularly sizable buff. The Baluch Regiment, or the Baluch Regiment, I think it's Baluch, please correct me if I'm wrong, now gives you +3 HQ defense on deployment rather than +2. Now this is a card which actually saw a lot of play at +2. However, it saw a lot of play at +2 back before there was any expansions in cards whatsoever. It saw play all the way back then. So, will this see play with +3? I mean, I don't think so. But I wouldn't write it off. +3 health is quite a bit. If you compare this to, say, an 845th is essentially just a Baluch regiment that you don't get the health right away. Sometimes you gain more, sometimes you gain less. However, it's a 2 cost for a 2/3 infantry. This is a 3 cost for a 3/4 infantry. It scales well. I think they're comparable. And yeah, you might see this played. It's not like Britain Control has a huge wealth of early game options. However, 3 is a little high. If this was a 2-cost, 2/3, gain +3, I think I could see play. 3-cost, 3/4, it's a little steep. But yeah, if you really want to make a Commonwealth deck, this is not a terrible choice. Go for it. Then we have the M4 Firefly, a buff to another British elite. And oh boy, this one is going to see play. I don't think it's broken. I don't think this is crazy. I just really wish that they would stop giving Britain all of the best elites and giving Britain, like, patching up the holes in the British collection that gives them weaknesses when you try to build British decks, because it is good to have certain nations have weaknesses when you try to build decks with them. And Britain's biggest weakness is the lack of hard removal. It's really, really difficult for Britain to remove very, very large things. Now, that has sort of been getting less and less true throughout the years, and that is sort of what is true with all weaknesses in all classes and card games. When you add more and more cards, is eventually these weaknesses start to go away, because inevitably you will have cards which start to accomplish what the weakness is. So like Monsoon Rot, for example, was a pretty big help for British control decks at removing potentially large boards or even just a single large target. This Firefly, it's not like an auto-include in every single deck ever, but it's a really good deployment effect. It kills T-34s, it kills Panther Gs is a really big one. Panther G has been a unit that Britain has historically really struggled to kill. Kills Panther A's, kills everything smaller than that. Yeah, I mean, this is just a card which, meta-dependent, you could potentially not run it. This is going to help against US mid-range, kills Shermans. I mean, yeah, this is just for 5-cost, 5/4 stats with a deployment effect, which is essentially just destroy a unit, but it's a very, very specific unit, so you keep it in hand until that happens. This is just a good card. I would play this in almost any British control deck. However, how strong are British control decks? Not bad, but not the most meta things in the game right now. So, yeah, if you have Firefly in your collection, you can feel happier that it has gone from absolutely atrocious to playable. And yeah, if you love playing, if your favorite deck is T-34 and you were hoping that they would maybe buff some T-34 synergy, apologies. Then, that is the end of British cards for people wanting to see nerfs to Close Air Support, to Monty, to Empire Strikes, to Shelling, to Sexton, to Monsoon Rod. I'm not saying I think these cards should all be nerfed, don't get me wrong, I'm just listing a whole lot of suggestions I have seen over the last few months of people demanding nerfs to Britain. Unfortunately, that is not going to be coming in this patch beyond the nerf to the 5th parachute. So, that brings us to the German cards with the 3rd Fallschirmjäger. Now, this is a card you've likely not seen, and yeah, it's intended to be a buff. I have seen some people arguing that this is a nerf. I can't say that I've played with this card in over 2 years, so I'm not an expert at saying which of these is stronger. However, the old version was deployment gets +1/+1 for each non-infantry unit type you control. So if you have a tank and an artillery and you play this, you get +2/+2. The new version is pretty different, actually. It has Blitz, which is already a huge benefit, because when you're playing an aggressively intended infantry, it has to either have Blitz or a really, really good effect, because infantry are incredibly slow. So it has Blitz, and then the wording has also been changed quite a bit. It's now at the start of your turn, it gets +1 attack for each tank in the same line. So if you play this, if you play a Panzer A on turn 1 in your support line, and then on turn 2 you play this, and you don't use the Blitz, at the start of your turn it will get +1 attack to go up to a 3/2, and then say you move the Panzer A to the front line, and you move this to the front line, and it pulls up a Felswagen, and then on the start of your next turn, this will get an additional +2 attack to go up to a 5/2. However, it no longer gains health. It's infantry, so it can't attack right away. It's at the start of your turn, not the end of your turn, so your opponent can still trade into it as a 2/2 when the turn is played. I don't think this card is particularly good, and I'm not entirely convinced this card is even better than the old version, but nobody played it before. I don't think anyone's going to play it now. Yeah. not a whole lot else to say about that card. Then we get to a pretty interesting change, in my opinion, the 361st Africa Regiment, which is a 3-cost 3/3 infantry for Germany. Again, it's an aggressively intended unit without infantry unit without blitz, so this is not a card that saw any play ever. Even if the fact is when this unit moves to the front line, deal 3 damage to the enemy HQ, that's really good. Compare that to an air blitz, where it's 3 cost, just deal 3 damage immediately. This is 3 cost a unit, which then can deal 3 damage, and potentially even do it multiple times if you're self-retreating, although that sounds terrible. The buff is it now is a 3/4. It has +1 health, so it sort of mirrors the Baluch Regiment now. The Baluch Regiment is deployment, gain 3 health, 3-cost 3/4. This is a 3-cost 3/4. When it moves to the front line, deal 3 damage. I actually really like having those mirrored effects. I think mirrored effects is very interesting in card games in general. I just like it thematically. And I think this is a good change for several reasons. One, this card is a Theaters of War card, and yeah, this card has sucked, and picking Germany, like buying the German campaign in Theaters of War, has never felt great because the cards you get aren't necessarily amazing. So yeah, I'm happy that they are the buffing cards in Theaters of War. Maybe it makes it more appealing for people to open those, buy those campaigns. And I would not be surprised if this saw play in the future. It's weird because right now the aggressive German decks are CA, and this does not fit in CA. Or it's Heinz, and this does not fit in Heinz. However, could there be a potential more mid-rangey style burn your opponent down over time with just good units, rather than requiring specific unit synergy, like unit type synergies? Maybe. And if you were trying to build that deck, Africa Regiment could definitely be a card to consider, because 3-cost 3/4 is pretty decent in stats. And yeah, dealing 3 damage for free is not bad. Then we get on to the Soviet changes. Those were all the German changes. So the first Soviet change up here is Barrage. This is a card that I wouldn't even be surprised if you didn't know existed. It was previously choose 1, enemy units have -3 attack this turn, or deal 5 damage to a ground unit. Now, if you are familiar with the card Hammer, which is a Soviet order, 3-cost, deal 6 damage to a ground unit, you might wonder, why would you run 4-cost to deal 5 damage to a ground unit? And the answer is, you wouldn't, which is why nobody has ever played Barrage before. The new version is 2-cost, choose 1, enemy units get -4 attack this turn, or deal 2 damage to a ground unit. Now, 2-cost to deal 2 damage to a ground unit's not great. If this was just 2-cost to deal 2 damage, I think this would be a lot more playable. I don't think it would be playable, but it would be a lot more playable, if that makes sense. But 2 damage to a ground unit is just not what you want for 2 credits. The other effect, -4 attack, for 2 credits, -4 attack, it's very good for what it does. However, how strong is reducing the attack of enemy units on your turn, and only your turn? So obviously the intention is you play that and then you attack into them, so your units don't take damage. However, that is a pretty specific situation, and this doesn't help if they have units and you don't have units, and this is also just a dead card if they don't have units themselves, or all of their units are blitz units, etc, etc. This card's not going to see play, but in general it's probably better there. Then we have it's probably the second biggest change, maybe the biggest. We'll have to see how impactful this is. There is a change to the 34th Guards. Now, if you've played the game in the last 2 months or 3 months or so, you will have, I'm sure, become very familiar with the deck Self-Damage, which essentially used this 34th Guards plus a couple other self-damage synergies and a lot of the self-damage cards in Soviets to, among other things, try to get out as many 34th Guards as quickly as possible to just try to overwhelm your opponent with tempo and stats. Now, 34th Guards, the text is staying absolutely the same, which is if this is in your hand when your HQ takes damage from a friendly source, it reduce its cost by 2. So that meant at 6 cost, if you took damage 3 times, it reduced to 0. Now it costs 7, which means if you take damage 3 times, it reduces to 1. Now, that's not necessarily a huge difference. Um, this is not killing the deck, which I think is good, because if they did just kill self-damage, and I mean, this patch did not touch air whatsoever. And I think air is probably the best deck in the game, followed by self-damage, so a slight touch to self-damage, and then maybe they're hoping that people figure out a counter to air. Maybe they're hoping air sort of balances out. Maybe. I don't know why there wasn't air nerfs in here, but we'll talk more about that later. We are still talking about the 34th guides, though. I think it's very, very difficult to evaluate just how much of an impact this has. My gut reaction is this isn't going to have much of an impact. I think self-damage is still going to be a tier 1 deck. In terms of, is it going to be like a top deck to ladder with anymore? One cost on every time you play a 34th guard. Self-damage is a deck that you are almost always using all of your credits. However, there's also a lot of times where you might have like overflow, right? Like you have a 2-cost 34th guides in your hand, and then you take damage twice, which means it would still go down to 0. So again, it's hard to say. It's definitely a nerf, obviously, and it's gonna slow down the deck slightly, but I suspect self-damage can bounce back from this. Then we have a third change to a Soviet card. Again, this is likely one you've never seen before. The A-20B, which was a 4-cost Soviet 3-4 bomber, costs 1 less to deploy if you control a US unit. So the idea is they're trying to have a thematic card off of like the Lend-Lease program. And yeah, it's interesting, I suppose. However, it's never been that good, even in Soviet US and US Soviet decks. It's changing to now is it costs 1 less for each US unit you control, which means it's essentially the same text as before. However, there's no bounds on it in terms of the cost reduction. So if you have 3 units, this costs 1. If you have 4 US units, this costs 0. However, they recognize that a 0-cost 3-4 bomber might be very, very strong, especially considering you can do stuff like pattern 32nd and play all 4 32nds on the same turn. So they reduce the stats from a 3-4 to a 3-2. So I think this card is terrible. I think arguably this might even be worse. Just because dealing 2 damage is so easy, and it does not have a deployment effect, and it does not have blitz. So if your opponent is likely going to remove this. However, you also have 4 US units if you're playing this for free, which means you might just be winning regardless of playing this card. Yeah, I would not recommend playing this card. Does not seem good. Then we get on to the US cards. So for the US is only getting 1 change, and the change is the SBD3 Dauntless. I've never actually read that card out loud before. I've just always called it the Dauntless. I don't know why it's an SBD3. That's incredibly difficult to say. Anyways, it was a 3-cost 3-3 heavy armor 1 bomber with 3 operation costs. It's now a 3-cost 3-3 heavy armor 1 bomber for 2 operation cost. So basically, it's just slightly easier to attack with. I think there's a 4-cost 3-4 heavy armor 1 bomber for 2 operation costs, so this is just a better version of that. Heavy armor on cheap units is very, very powerful. I think Samavante is a very underrated card. It's the 3-cost 3-3 heavy armor 1 tank in Italy. However, 2 operation costs, a little high, and the US does not have a ton of synergies with this. I would be surprised if this is good enough to run in a Brit-US air deck, and I don't see this being run in a US main deck whatsoever, so not going to have a huge impact on the meta. Arguably, it's even potentially a nerf if you ran this with Bolster, which I would argue is probably the only reason you would run this before. I'm not saying that it actually is a nerf, but yeah, it feels bad for all the people running this in their Bolster decks. Then we get on to the Japanese changes. So first up, we have Aichi. The devs have been pretty vocally trying to push for Japan Air to be better in recent patches and recent expansions, and I think Aichi is likely another step in that direction. It was previously a 2-cost 2/1 bomber with destruction, deal 1 damage to the enemy HQ. This saw a very small amount of play in fringe decks. This was never a competitive card. Now it is a 2-cost 2/2 bomber with destruction. If it's the enemy's turn, add an Aichi D3A2 to your support line, which is the 3-cost 3/2 smokescreen bomber that gains attack for every other Aichi you have. So basically what this means is, if your opponent kills it, you get a 3-cost 3/2. Well, the cost doesn't matter since you're getting it for free, but it replaces itself with a 3/2 smokescreen bomber. So that's very, very interesting. It means Aichi is an incredibly sticky card. This is going to be a pretty big buff to Aichi decks, because not only is this Aichi buffing the attack of all Aichis you already have on the board, now if you kill this, this is summoning another Aichi, so your Aichi attack stays the same, and the new Aichi also has smokescreen, which is then being buffed by your other Aichis on the board. So, yeah, that's a lot of Aichi synergy. I've said the word Aichi like 10 times in the last 30 seconds. Now, how good is an Aichi deck? I don't think it's going to be that good. And how good are Aichi in a Japan air deck? I don't even think you want to run Aichis in a Japan air deck. I think their fighters are much more interesting in terms of, like, from a competitive sense. And I don't think you want to run both, because you at that point you're just running too many units. But could this be in the future with a couple other cards? I mean, if Japan gets a card like Empire Strikes, that could be a very interesting possibility. Could this even be run in Britain Air? Just because it's a bomber. 2-cost bomber, not bad. And if your opponent kills it, it replaces itself with another bomber, which gets another guaranteed attack because that's smokescreen. Well, almost guaranteed. Maybe? That would be very, very sad. The devs have a long history of buffing cards for specific decks, and then that card is only run in Britain Air. So maybe that's going to be the case again. We will have to see. Now, the other Japanese card change is to Ancient Empire, which is probably one of the worst cards in the game. Prior to this, it was a 5-cost Japanese order, give your HQ +4 defense and all friendly units +1/+1. The problem is, it's very, very expensive for the healing. It's very, very expensive for the stats gain, and decks that want the stats gain and decks that want the healing are diametrically opposed, and there's also just better versions of both of those in their own cards. So, yeah, it never saw play, and it was never going to see any play without changes. Now, they did change it, but they changed it quite drastically. They did not keep the original design of the card in mind at all. They completely reworked it, which is fine. The original card was not exactly interesting. Now, they reworked it into a 2-cost order. Set your own HQ's defense to 8. Draw an Ancient Empire from your deck. So the point of this is you set your HQ below 10 immediately for 2 cost, and then that means you can trigger all of your Sunrise divisions, the artillery, which I do not remember the name of, the home defense. So all these cards that require your HQ to be below 10, they were most of them are aggressive cards. So the old problem was, well, if you're playing an aggressive deck, you're not taking damage, so it's hard to use your cards that require having taken damage, and there was basically no self-damage in Japan. Now, you can just immediately set your HQ to 8 and start slamming down 9/9s on turn 3. Now, that might seem very scary, however, you've also set yourself to 8 on turn 2, which means your opponent might just kill you. Now, to make up for the fact that your opponent might just kill you, you draw a new Ancient Empire every single time. So, if you set yourself to 8, your opponent hits you down to 7, your opponent hits you for 7 down to 1, you can play a second Ancient Empire, you heal back up to 8, and then you draw a third Ancient Empire. Now, the problem, and there's quite a few problems, because if that's just how it worked all the time, that sounds very, very interesting, that sounds very, very fun. It does not sound necessarily crazy good, but it sounds fun. The problem is, you can draw Ancient Empire normally, which means you would result in 2 Ancient Empires in your hand at once, which would be terrible. And 2, your opponent's not going to attack you if they know you have Ancient Empire in your hand, unless they will kill you. And it's not difficult to deal 8 damage in one turn. So basically what that means is your opponent will dedicate all of their credits and all of their resources to removing your board unless they can kill you in one turn. So the other Ancient Empires are not doing anything in your hand, which means you basically just have a dead card. It's a dead card you drew for free, so it's not the end of the world, but it also means that you're not playing that one to draw additional Ancient Empires, which means you are increasing the odds that you draw another Ancient Empire normally, which is just a brick to draw. And yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Don't get me wrong, it's very interesting. I think that deck and that archetype requires a lot more support, and this was the last Japanese change, and I personally was really hoping for an interesting and good Japan control card, maybe an interesting and good like mono Japan deck, maybe some better or more additional Japan air cards. No, we got the Japan below 10 health synergy card, which is a deck that I don't think anybody cares about, and it's a deck that there just isn't enough support in the game currently to exist. I feel like it would need an expansion worth of cards to be even considerable, but I mean, it's also fine for them to make a lot of different strategies okay, because a lot of people play this game for fun and don't play this game competitively. So, yeah, that's it for the Japan changes. Now we get on to a series of wild changes to the Poland's lesser half, the Exile cards. So, Exile is a mechanic where the card can be run in two different nations. Basically, the card can count as a card from two different nations. So, I'll explain that with a couple of examples in a bit. Poland has also had a bunch of cards which basically have synergy with other Exile cards, trying to build an Exile archetype. I don't think this was really an idea when Exile was first released. I think it was just meant to be like a fun thing, but then they realized nobody used it because there was just like subpar vanilla cards you could run in two nations. So now they're trying to make Exile an actual synergy, so there's a reason to run Exile cards, and I think that's very interesting. The problem is there just was not a lot of them, so they decided to make a lot of them, which is what they're doing now. So the first one is the PZLP11. My goodness. All of these cards have terrible names. Which used to be a 3-cost 2/3 fighter. Your Exile cards cost 1 less to a minimum of 1. Now, the problem with this is this takes up a Polish card slot, and it's cost 3 already. It's pretty easy to remove. No less than 1 means that you can't use this to like spam down a bunch of cheap Exile cards. However, they realized that and have decided that, nah, if Exile's gonna work, Exile's gonna work. So they decided to make this a 1-cost 1/2. Your Exile cards cost 1 less. Static effect. There is no bounds on that. So if you have 3 of these on the board, because it is a limited, all of your Exile cards cost 3 less. And if you have an Exile card that costs 3, that Exile card will now cost 0. However, this card itself is not Exile. It does not discount itself. You can't play this and then another one for free and then another one for free and then do all of that on turn 1. Nope, this card does not have Exile. But a 1-cost 1/2 bomber, or sorry, a 1-cost 1/2 fighter is not a terrible stat line. It's not a great stat line. But it's much more workable. Anything that costs 1 and you're playing it for the effect is fine. If this was a 1/1, it would be still fine in an Exile deck. Now the question is, how good is our Exile decks? Well, let's take another look at another change to an Exile card, the Hurricane PL. This is a British Exile card, which means you can play this as a British card without Poland ally, or you can play this in a British-Poland deck, and it will count as a British card. It will not count for one of your 12 Poland ally slots. It formerly was a 3-cost 3/3 fighter deployment, give another Exile unit +1/+1. It's now deployment, give another friendly Exile unit +1/+1 and -1 operation. So, essentially just a slight buff to a card, an Exile card, which buffs other Exile cards. Then, let's move on to the third buff to Exile cards, the third and final buff for this round of patches, the Mark 1 PL, the Battle Mark 1 PL. This is also a British Exile card, and this card was formerly a 1/1 the first order you give each turn also gives your units +1/+1. So all of your units get +1/+1 whenever you play the first order of the turn while this is on the board. And so 4 cost 1/1. So not great. I mean, it buffs itself. So if you play this and then an order, it's a 4 cost 2/2. Still not amazing. It did not see a lot of play. The new version, they decided to make it Exile synergy. Before it was just Exile. It's now a 2 cost 1/2 bomber. When you deploy another Exile unit, give it +1/+1 passive effect. So this one you want to get out first. So let's quickly run through the other Exile cards in the game. So there is the Lysander, which is a British Exile 2 cost 1/2 plane. There is the MS-406, the French Polish Exile card. Is just a 3 cost 3/3 plane fighter. There is the PZL-37. This card does not have Exile, but when it's destroyed, well, when any friendly Polish air unit is destroyed, it gives you a random Polish Exile card. So this can be from any nation. Then you have the 2-2M-PL. Oh, these names are butchering me, guys. Oh my goodness. I don't want to play this deck just because no one is going to remember the names of any of these cards. This is a Soviet Exile 3/3 heavy armor 1. When a friendly unit with heavy armor survives combat, give +1/+1. This one does not have a ton of synergy because the other Exile cards do not have heavy armor. However, you could run this in a, say, British Poland deck because it is a Poland card with Soviet Exile, meaning you could play this in a Soviet deck, or you can play this in a Poland deck with Britain. Exile gets pretty confusing if you don't know how it works. Then we move away from the planes for a second. We get the M4 Sherman PL, which is a US Exile. It's a 3/4 for 4 tank. However, it gains Blitz and operates for free if you played an Exile card this turn. So this card getting its cost reduced gets pretty interesting, because if this card is a 2 cost, 0 operation, 3/4 Blitz tank, that's pretty good. And the operates for free triggers every time that happens. So say you blitz this and for free, you blitz this and operate it for free, and then it goes back up to 2 operation cost, and then you play another Exile unit the next turn, this still operates for free. So Exile has quite a few snowball mechanics. Of course, you have the T-34-76PL, which is a 4 cost 4/4 heavy armor 1 blitz tank, which is Soviet Exile, as the name T-34 would suggest. I mean, just on its own, purely based on the stats, this is probably the best Exile card. However, it does not really have synergy with any other Exile card, unless you're running both the Soviet Exile ones, but I don't think you would. And last but not least, you have the Spitfire Mark V PL, which is a British Exile, 6 cost, 5/6 fighter, deployment, give a friendly infantry +1/+1 and guard. Not a ton of synergy with the other Exile cards, and it's pretty expensive. So, with all of that being said, those are the Exile cards that can have their cost reduced or have synergy with other Exile cards. I think if you were building an Exile deck, and maybe once this patch comes out I'll make a separate video on trying to build an Exile deck, I think you would make it a Britain-Poland, probably air-themed Exile deck, where you're running the fighter that reduces the cost of Exile units. You're running the bomber, which every time an Exile unit, or every time a friendly Polish air unit dies, you get another Exile unit. You'll probably run the Shermans just because it's a really powerful effect. You're running the one that probably both the ones that buff Exiles. And the reason you do it for Britain Poland is for a couple of reasons. One, most of the cards are British Exile, which means you can probably fit in more Polish cards than you might otherwise be able to. And two, it's because Britain, I think you would just run this with a Britain air package. I think you would run this with close air support and the British cheap air units, because if you're already playing out a ton of air units, which are units that can attack from the support line, and you run this with, say, other units that can attack from the support line, and then buffs that will typically target units in the support line. Yeah, maybe Britain-Poland air is the next air meta deck. We've seen Britain-Japan, we've seen Britain-Italy, we've seen Britain-US. I've seen Britain-Germany and Britain-Soviet both being fine. Yeah, maybe it's time for Britain-Poland. At this point, Britain-France is basically the only deck we haven't seen have an air version with it. So yeah, that's pretty exciting to see if it works. If it works too well, it could be very, very, very bad. But I don't think it's going to work too well. I think it's going to work fine. And I'm interested to see if that can make any splash on the competitive scene, because it's always interesting having a new archetype. But maybe in 2 months, I will look back at this and in regret when we're all being dominated by Exile deck high rolls that dump their entire hand by like turn 3. But moving on, we have one final change to wrap up this patch. It is the change to the Rima, or the deuxième Rima, I should say. So this is not a huge shock, and arguably maybe it's even potentially a buff. So the old Rima, if you've never seen it, is a 5-cost 3/6 guard infantry for France, with the passive effect at the end of your turn, give all of your other units mobilize. So that's a very powerful effect. At the end of every turn, if Rima is alive, all of your other units get mobilized, meaning all of those units have to take damage or die, or they will get +1/+1 at the start of the turn. And then if Rima sticks at the end of their turn, everything gets mobilized again. So it's really good at snowballing. We've seen Soviet France be a really powerful deck in the tournament and on ladder, just because you can play a lot of these very, very sticky units, a lot of these guard units, and they're just constantly getting mobilized, and they're difficult to all deal with. So, yeah, I think they probably looked at the stats and saw that Rima was doing very, very well, a little too well. I'm assuming that's why they nerfed it, because Soviet France wasn't necessarily a incredibly game-breaking deck on its own, but I would not be surprised if they looked at the stats and saw that that was entirely based on the power of Rima. So they only made a little tweak. It's now, at the end of your turn, give adjacent units mobilize. So that's actually pretty interesting, because it means you might have to decide between giving potentially 2 units mobilize or guarding your HQ. Because if you have Rima between 2 units, it means it's not next to the HQ, but maybe one of those other units is a guard. So you have HQ, guard, Rima, another unit. So that's obviously just a stricter nerf. It's no longer all of your units, and that's perfectly fine. And strategically speaking, I'm a huge fan of this change, because it's very interesting to me. When you need to make these decisions on where you place the Rima, and then once the Rima is on the board, where you move the Rima, where you move other units, do you keep units back to continually give them mobilize? However, to make up for the fact that this is just a reduction of its power, they gave it an additional attack, so it's now a 4/6 instead of a 3/6, and that is nothing to sniff at. 4 attack is very, very good. It means it's out of honorable death range, it's out of amphibious assault range, it means it kills Shermans, it means it kills 5th Rangers. 4 attack does a lot in this game. It is an incredibly powerful attack, like a damage break. I think probably the most important attack damage break is between 2 and 3. However, I think that is followed by 3 and 4. So, 4 attack is very, very good on the Rima itself, considering Rima does not give itself mobilize, meaning it is stuck on the 3/6 body. So, having it 4/6 means it can defend itself slightly easier. So, yeah, that's pretty interesting. And that wraps up all of the changes in this patch. Again, this patch is it's coming out between January 21st and January 28th, probably the 25th or the 26th. So, if you're looking forward to this patch, make sure you log in then to try out the new decks, try out how bad your favorite decks are, the ones that got nerfed, how bad were the nerfs. So here I want to say my thoughts on this patch as a whole. So some things that I think this patch did well is buffs to either decks that basically did not exist before, or I think they did a very good job with the buffs in general, trying to make a wide range of decks playable, because there is a lot of people who enjoy a lot of different things in this game, and with a huge expansion in hopefully spring 2023, so only maybe a couple months away even. Um, we're going to see a lot more cards. So maybe these are sort of a sign of what potential decks that are going to be pushed in the next expansion, or maybe these are decks that are not going to be pushed in the next expansion, so they're being given a little something now, and then new decks are going to be pushed in the next expansion. We'll have to see. But in general, I think the Ancient Empire change is very interesting. Not good, but very interesting. I think the Aichi change has a lot of potential. The Exile decks I'm very excited to play around with. I think nerfs to Rima were done well. I think a couple of the nerfs were done really well. I'm a fan of the change to Rima. 34th Guards, as much as I love playing self-damage, that one did probably need a nerf. And I'm glad the nerf did not completely gut the deck, so I think they did a very good job on the 34th. I like the Baluch and the Africa Regiment changes thematically. Firefly, I don't think needed a change. Britain Control did not need a buff. There are worse elites in the game than the Firefly that needed it, if you're just strictly looking at play rates. So, yeah, it's not a terrible change, but timing, guys. And lastly, the parachute change. Huge fan of the parachute change. So, really, in this entire patch, there's not a whole lot of anything that I strongly dislike that they did change. However, that brings us to what they did not change. I am genuinely shocked they did not touch air. Okay, well, I should actually change that statement maybe a little bit. I am not as shocked as I should be that they did not change air, because this is something they continually do with specifically air. I'm not trying to badmouth 1939. I really like 1939, and I think they did a really good job at the things they did change. But just, why do they love air so much? Would it be so bad if you nerfed air to the point where it's no longer a tier 1 deck for a few months, and then if you really wanted to come back and give it something to play with in the new expansion? They keep doing small changes to air, and then when air continues to be good, they wait a month, and then air continues to be good and usually actually gets better in that month, and then they do small changes again, and maybe those small changes have an impact. For example, the Spitfire nerf, the Wellington nerf. The cast change was just a strict buff. I think we should all agree on that by now. But the Finest Hour nerf, these are real nerfs to real cards that were run in Brit Air. Some of them stopped being run. Some of them are still run even if they are nerfed. However, then they also just wheel it out with some buff to a card that immediately fits into Brit Air, so it doesn't really matter when the win rate actually goes up. So, for example, the Fiat, where they nerfed Brit Air, but in the same patch they buffed the Fiat, and then Britain Italy Air became better, or the best version of Air, and then arguably better than the pre-nerfed version of the old Air deck. So, yeah. Why they didn't make changes to close air support or Empire Strikes. A lot of people have been asking about Monty. This is a card that, I've been playing cards for a very long time. People have been asking for Monty to be changed since literally the day I joined. And, before that, obviously, but I have been seeing people ask for Monty to be changed since the day I started playing cards, and it has seen one change since then, which was from pin all units draw a card, or pin all enemy units draw a card, to its current version. And I've seen a lot of people asking for Monty to be nerfed. I would not be shocked if it was nerfed. I would not be shocked if it was not nerfed. I don't think Monty is, the hill I'm gonna die on. Because outside of Brit Air, Britain it's good. Don't get me wrong, there's a lot of good Britain decks, but it's not a game-breaking, every single top deck is Britain. There's a lot of other options for a lot of other nations. It's just Britain does have some very powerful specific cards. So, yeah, nerfs to Britain, I did expect to see more. And I did kind of expect to see a nerf to 5th Rangers. I think that card has been incredibly overperforming, especially with the nerf to self-damage. Self-damage is really the reason US mid-range is not dominating the meta. And I don't think this nerf is going to kill US mid-range, or kill self-damage, so I don't think US mid-range is going to suddenly, explode in popularity. But I am kind of surprised that there was not a more wide-ranging of tiny nerfs to meta decks. So, like, if they made a small nerf to Brit Air, the small nerf they did make to self-damage, and then maybe a small nerf to US mid-range, um, yeah, that would have been nice. So, yeah, there's a lot of things that I wish they did do in this patch. I kind of hope we aren't going to go another 2 months before the next patch, but I suspect we are. So, yeah, I mean, this patch does do enough to spice up the meta for the next 2 months, along with the constant flow of skirmish cards. I don't think the game is like as the most stale it's ever been. The game has been incredibly stale at various points in the past. I think the game's actually relatively refreshing at the moment. I'm just, from a purely competitive point of view, I'm shocked they did not nerf Brit Air. Well, I'm not shocked. I'm appalled that they did not nerf Brit Air. I am genuinely insulted as somebody who plays this game competitively. But yeah, that's it for me talking about these cards. If you want to give me your thoughts, what you think about my thoughts, did I miss something? Do you think I over-exaggerated how bad a nerf is? Do I think I overestimated how good a buff is? Let me know all of your thoughts in the comments, or if you want to have longer discussions with other like-minded people or myself, you can join my Discord and continue the conversation over there. And subscribe if you haven't, like the video, share it around the cards community, YouTube things. Thank you very much for watching, and I will catch you in the next one. Goodbye, guys.